How about now? Okay. Well, as we've heard over the last couple days, the Grand Canyon, of course, has the power to capture the hearts of many of the people that hike into it or float down its river. But as it turns out, the Grand Canyon also has the power to capture the hearts of people who never actually set foot inside of it. On a warm July morning in the summer of 1929, the normally quiet canyons of the Little Colorado River echoed with the roar of a big aircraft engine. The biplane had come soaring low over the desert from Winslow and was now tracing the tributary north toward its confluence with the main Colorado River. From her seat in an open-air cockpit, young Anne Lindbergh could see the approaching chasm of the Grand Canyon in the distance, and further beyond, the faint silhouette of Navajo Mountain. In the forward cockpit, her famous husband, Charles, signaled for her to take the controls. Grabbing the stick, she guided the plane into a gentle banking curve as Charles leaned out over the side of the aircraft, holding a big black Graflex camera. Carefully adjusting the lens, the world's most famous pilot quickly brought the world's most famous canyon into focus and began taking pictures. Just 2 years earlier, Charles Lindbergh had flown into history by making the first nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean, flying from New York City to Paris in his custom monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. This historic event turned the young airmail pilot into an overnight celebrity, and he was named by the press the Lone Eagle and Lucky Lindy. Back home in the United States, he received a ticker tape parade through downtown New York City, and Time magazine named him their first ever Man of the Year. A true believer in the power of aviation, Charles Lindbergh thought that air transportation would, quote, bring peoples together in intercourse and understanding. In the year after his famous flight, he traveled all around the country and around much of the world promoting aviation and the construction of new aircraft and airports. Tall, handsome, intelligent, and serious-minded, Lindbergh seemed to embody a promising new age of progress where science and engineering could solve any problem. In his best-selling book about the flight, entitled We, Lindbergh credited his success not just to himself, but also to his airplane, and more importantly, to the, quote, American science and genius that had helped build it. The role of technology in his life was not lost on the Arizona Republic newspaper when Lindbergh visited Tucson in September of 1927. The newspaper held up Lindbergh as a model for youth everywhere and suggested that they, quote, emulate the degree of perfection and reliability of both the boy and his machine. Lindbergh also got involved in a number of early pioneering air transportation companies, perhaps the most important of which was the ambitious Transcontinental Air Transport, or TAT, which was planning to start America's first coast-to-coast airline service between New York and Los Angeles. As the company's chief technical officer, one of Lindbergh's first jobs was to determine the exact route. Because of the dangers of the Rocky Mountains, he decided to dip south in the west and choose a route going through northern Arizona and New Mexico. But the Southwest had challenges all of its own. With a sparse population, there was limited facilities and very few modern airports. And so, in the spring of 1928, Lindbergh began a series of survey flights through the area to evaluate the final specific route and select possible locations for new airports. One of these survey trips started on April 13th, 1928, when he left California in a new Ryan Brougham monoplane with two TAT investors, Harold Bixby and Harry Knight, as passengers. Now, their original plan was to fly from Los Angeles to the newly built Red Butte Airfield at Grand Canyon, but they got a late start, and as night began to fall, they detoured south and landed for the night at Williams in the small pasture that served as the Williams Airfield. The next morning, Lindbergh was concerned about the small size of the field and was worried about taking off with a full load. And so Knight and Bixby ended up hiring a car to take them the rest of the way to the Grand Canyon, while Lindbergh took off alone to fly there by himself. He arrived up at Red Butte, refueled, and with time to spare, and nobody else's safety to worry about but his own, he decided to explore the canyon by air. Taking off, he flew out over the rim, spent a few minutes getting the lay of the land and testing the air currents, and then put the Ryan into a steep dive, shooting down into the canyon below the rim at 120 miles per hour. Later, his friend, pilot Phil Love, would mark up this postcard to commemorate the event. Dropping down 4,000 feet into the canyon in a matter of seconds, he went down into the inner gorge before leveling out and following along the route of the river, running the rapids 1,000 feet up in the air. Many years later, he would relish this first experience of the canyon in the air and would remember how he went, quote, weaving in and out among the sharp-shadowed cliffs, now less than a wingspan above ledges where no man's foot had ever trod. That evening, Lindbergh rejoined his companions at the El Tovar Lodge. In the morning, they all climbed back into the Ryan and followed the river upstream to Moab and then east to Denver. The total journey had completely sold Bixby and Knight on the viability of air passenger service. Back home in St. Louis, they raved to the reporters about the benefits of air travel. Regarding their time at the Grand Canyon, they made little mention of the scenery, but gleefully bragged how, quote, "We flew from rim to rim of the canyon in just 12 minutes, a distance that would have taken about 2 days by the usual means of travel." Once an imposing barrier to travelers, the Grand Canyon, like the Atlantic Ocean before, had been conquered by aviation. Ultimately, Lindbergh and the TAT selected a path through Arizona that roughly followed the line of Route 66. By the end of the year, they were building their own private airfields at Winslow and Kingman. Even though the Grand Canyon would not be directly on the route, Lindbergh still found himself drawn to it. Years later, he would admit that during business flights to the region, he would, quote, frequently take a detour to follow the Colorado River through its barren wilderness of rock and desert. His flight logs and maps from this period bear this out. In his trips through northern Arizona, his flight paths seemed to unnecessarily converge on the Grand Canyon rather than simply following the route of the TAT. Perhaps Lindbergh sensed that there was more to the Grand Canyon than how quickly you could get across it. About a year after that first flight in the canyon, in the spring of 1929, Charles Lindbergh's interest in the area took him to Washington, D.C. to visit the offices of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. This was an early scientific research center that was involved in a number of scientific activities across the Four Corners area. Their chief archaeologist, Dr. Alfred Kidder, was involved in major excavations at Pecos Pueblo near Santa Fe. And the head of the institute, Dr. John C. Merriam, was a paleontologist who shared Lindbergh's fascination with the Grand Canyon. Merriam was also a close friend of park director Stephen Mather and an advisor to the National Park Service, and was involved with the funding and design of the small Yavapai Geology Museum at Yavapai Point. Like the TAT, the scientists faced several challenges in the vast distances and rough terrain of the Colorado Plateau. Many of the areas that they wished to study were remote and very difficult to reach. And from an educational standpoint, the vast size of the Grand Canyon could often overwhelm visitors. Even the expansive views from Yavapai Point revealed only a tiny portion of the canyon and gave no real sense of the structure of the larger region beyond. During their meeting in the spring of 1929, Merriam and Lindbergh quickly realized that aircraft could help solve many of these problems. Aircraft could explore remote locations, perhaps discover new prehistoric ruins, and take photographs of prominent features to use for educational purposes. Always looking for ways to further advance the use of aviation, Lindbergh quickly volunteered his services as a pilot. Merriam was overjoyed and reported to Kidder that, quote, "Lindbergh has flown over the whole Colorado Plateau region and is greatly interested in that area." Unfortunately, they would have to wait a few weeks for Lindbergh to get involved in this new project because at that time he was also busy getting married. In May of 1929, he was married to Ann Morrow, the daughter of the American ambassador to Mexico. As part of their honeymoon, the TAT asked them to fly along the entire TAT route one last time as an inspection tour before they started actual passenger service that summer. After conferring very briefly with Merriam, they set off in July of 1929 in an open cockpit Curtiss Falcon biplane and reached the TAT airport at Albuquerque, New Mexico on July 4th. The following morning, they detoured north to take photographs of archaeological sites in Chaco Canyon and Canyon de Chelly before spending the night at Winslow. The next morning, on July 6th, they set out again to take photographs of the Grand Canyon. Flying northwest from Winslow, they intersected the Little Colorado River near Cameron and followed it north to its union with the Grand Canyon, taking 2 photographs along the way. This is one of them looking north along the Little Colorado, the Grand Canyon in the distance, and way up there under the scratch on the image is Navajo Mountain in the distance. Upon reaching the Grand Canyon, they hung a left and proceeded downstream, but they did bank back momentarily to take a picture of where they'd just come from. This is looking upstream along the river. You get nice views of the river and the sandbanks. Up there in the distance, you can see Chuar Butte, and to the right of it is the entrance to the Little Colorado River. And this sandy area down here on the right is Comanche Creek. Proceeding a little bit farther downstream, they're starting to get into the main heart of the canyon. Here you see a nice picture of Vishnu Temple. It's a little bit skewed because it's kind of hard to take photos with a big camera and a bucking biplane. But again, nice picture of Vishnu Temple and Wootton's throne there on the left. Now, they're not really having specific targets of things they want to take pictures of. They're really capturing just a range of images to show the variety of perspectives and pictures that they can get for the scientists. Another image very close to that last one is Newberry Butte. Looking back up, you see the river, and faintly there in the middle where the square is, you can even see Sockdolliger Rapids. Heading down to the area of the village, they actually lifted themselves up and out of the canyon a little bit to get some pictures of what the rim looked like. I'm not exactly sure of the location of this image, but I'm pretty sure it's the south rim somewhere between the village and Havasu. At Havasu, they took one of their few photographs that is looking straight down. This is looking into the main part of Havasu Canyon. These dark lines through here, these are trees and plants associated with the fields of Supai Village. The main Grand Canyon is up here to the north, and the falls would be just off the photograph to the top. The scientists were very interested in photographs of modern Native American communities in order to compare them to prehistoric sites, which is probably why this image was taken. Heading on a little bit farther downstream, they come to Tuckup Canyon. This is looking kind of from the south side of the canyon, looking across the Grand Canyon and then up into Tuckup Canyon. This photo, as you can see, gives a really nice perspective on the Esplanade platform. Now, we take images like this somewhat for granted today. Aerial photographs and satellite images are pretty common, but this was a rare view of the Grand Canyon back in 1929, so you can understand the value of this for the scientists. Finally, as the day began to wane, they headed south to spend the night at the TAT airport at Kingman. In the space of a single day, they had traveled over 100 miles of canyons and had taken nearly a dozen photographs of various geological features throughout the canyon. Writing to her family that night from Kingman, Anne described their last few days' adventures and noted how, quote, "We took a great many pictures and thought it was very hot and dry and sandy, but it was all very thrilling." Although she had enjoyed seeing the canyon from the air, she also in many ways missed having that direct contact with it, as she had felt when she'd visited the rim with her family many years earlier. In some ways, she was actually more struck by the desolate desert environment of Kingman, where she noted to her father, quote, "We arrived on an unusually cold day. It was only about 99 degrees Fahrenheit." The Lindberghs reached Los Angeles on July 7th, but it was not until July 12th that they could quietly slip away and meet with Dr. Miriam in San Francisco to review their photographs. Miriam was very much impressed with the images, and it inspired him to envision having them make a sequence of aerial photographs that would span across the Grand Canyon and then all the way up north to Utah's Bryce Canyon, essentially a photomosaic map of the Colorado Plateau, somewhat similar to the map on the floor in the headquarters next door. He noted that, quote, "Such a series of photographs would give a view of one of the most interesting geological regions in the world and would be a big help to the educational programs at Yavapai Point." Writing to Kidder, Miriam acknowledged that these first photographs were, quote, "merely an initial reconnaissance, but it indicates to me what can be accomplished in geological work." Miriam was also impressed with the archaeological photographs that the Lindberghs had taken earlier in their flight, and at his recommendation, the Lindberghs a few days later flew out to New Mexico, landed at Pecos, and spent several days working with Dr. Kidder. Over those days, Dr. Kidder directed them to various archaeological sites in the region where they took a number of photographs, including this photograph here on the left, which is the famous Pueblo Bonito ruin at Chaco Canyon, and here on the right, which is the junction of Canyon de Chelly and Canyon Muerto in northern Arizona. The Lindberghs even briefly landed their plane on the rim of Canyon de Chelly in order to hike down to a cliff dwelling. Finally, on July 25th, the exhausted couple began their long trip back home to New York City. In the space of the last few weeks, they had produced an impressive catalog of over 200 aerial photographs of the Southwest. Over the following months, the Carnegie scientists continued to study the Lindbergh images. Writing to Kidder, Miriam predicted that the photographs, quote, "will, I am sure, be enormously valuable." That fall, the Lindberghs and Kidder joined together again down in Belize and spent several days taking aerial photographs of Mayan ruins down in the Yucatan. They also made plans for additional projects throughout the Southwest and South America, but nature had other plans. Shortly after their return from Belize, Anne discovered that she was pregnant, and now the couple's efforts focused on setting up a home and preparing to raise a family. Although Lindbergh's time at the canyon had been brief, his experiences there stayed with him and would take on new meaning later on in his life. By the 1960s, an elderly Lindbergh was increasingly questioning the very ideals that had brought him fame and success in his youth. The Second World War had revealed a darker side to aviation and technology. Instead of bringing peace and prosperity, aircraft had left bombed-out cities around the world, and science's unlocking of the atom now threatened humanity's existence during the Cold War. Lindbergh was particularly alarmed at how aviation had accelerated the expansion of civilization into previously pristine natural areas with little restraint or concern for long-term consequences. During his tours and long-distance flights of the 1920s, Lindbergh had traveled over much of the Earth's surface, including many remote areas that were sparsely populated. He would later recall, quote, "Looking down from low altitudes from those early days of flying, I had contact with expanses of North American wilderness in a way no man has experienced before." Visiting many of those same locations 3 decades later, he was shocked by how rapidly and extensively they had been developed. Small towns had become congested cities, and vast sections of forest had entirely disappeared. Only a handful of regions still retained the raw wild state that he remembered from his youth, and he increasingly saw them as unique areas to be valued and protected. The Grand Canyon was one of those places that was special to Lindbergh. Most of the features captured in his 1929 photographs had changed little in the last 30 years. He remembered Miriam's discussions about the geology of the area and the millions of years of Earth's history recorded in the fossils of the canyon walls, and he began to take a longer view of humanity, seeing it as basically yet another bud in the ever-evolving tree of life on Earth. Quote, "It is in nature we root," he observed, "and it is essential for us that we care well for our rooting grounds." By the mid-1960s, both Charles and Anne were publicly supporting numerous environmental causes, with Charles joining the board of the World Wildlife Fund. Lindbergh's growing interest in conservation soon brought him into contact with Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall. The son of Mormon pioneers, Udall's childhood in the small northern Arizona town of Joseph City had led him to value open spaces and contact with the natural world. As Secretary of the Interior, he had helped pass the 1964 Wilderness Act. In a June 1966 letter to Udall, Lindbergh looked back over his long career in aviation and admitted that, quote, "I have often asked myself whether aeronautics and astronautics were actually a boon to the human race. To date, I have been forced to the negative conclusion." He went on to say, "I am convinced that the long-term survival of our civilization depends more on our appreciation of nature than on our amassment of knowledge and the development of science." The two men would develop a close working relationship, with Lindbergh serving as a science advisor and quietly lobbying for Udall's various conservation projects. At the time, as you all know, and as David mentioned in his talk, Udall's department was embroiled in a debate surrounding 2 proposed dams on the Colorado River as part of the Central Arizona Project, or CAP. One of these dams would submerge much of Marble Canyon, and the other would flood parts of the Grand Canyon proper. Proponents of the dam, which included many of Udall's supporters in Arizona, pointed out the necessity of these dams for the state's future prosperity. Conservationists decried the impact on the canyon and the precedent that it would set for other national parks. Sympathetic to both sides, Udall struggled to find resolution. Although their correspondence does not mention the dam specifically, it is likely that the old pilot's regrets and observations left some impression on the secretary's mind. Ultimately, Udall dropped his support for the dams, a decision that would help preserve the canyons, but would effectively end his political career. Charles Lindbergh died at his home in Hawaii on August 26, 1974. For the last decade of his life, he had sought to balance and mitigate some of the consequences of the rapid growth and spread of technology and industry that he had so famously symbolized during the first decade of his career. Looking back over a long life of world travels and achievements, he found that aviation had served him best when it allowed him to connect with the larger natural world rather than conquer it. In an unpublished essay written near the end of his life, he talked about how aviation had given him a special connection with nature, and he noted, quote, "There were places on the earth that were intimately mine, though I might never set foot upon them. places where I would sometimes fly off route for hours to return to. There was in particular the upper gorge of the Colorado, mile after mile of rocky wilderness, the white rapids of the river, the soft, dry colors of the desert, the grotesque canyon walls, and no road or hut or sign of man. This was a view of the Grand Canyon that no single photograph could capture, but it ultimately was the one that stayed with Charles Lindbergh for the remainder of his life. Thank you.